Good evening. My name is Aaron Bryant, and I'm curator of photography, visual culture, and contemporary history here at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Welcome to another iteration of our signature film series, Historically Speaking. I am pleased to be joined by the director and featured stars of The Cast of Passing, a film adaptation of Nella Larsen's brilliant 1929 novel, now showing on Netflix. Joining me is Rebecca Hall, who wrote, produced, and makes her directorial debut with this feature film, and Passing's two featured actresses, Tessa Thompson and Ruth Negga. All righty. Well, thank you all for partnering with us on this program, Historically Speaking. And I must say, after watching the film, I was so incredibly moved, I could hardly think straight. Nella Larsen is really one of those writers from the Harlem Renaissance that people aren't as familiar with. She's written a number of books as well as a short story, which had a controversy attached. But I think most folks who know her are from literary criticism, particularly African American literary criticism, and we know about Passing and Quicksand. So it was an interesting choice, Rebecca, to do this film. I was just wondering, how did you come across this project, and why did you decide to do the book as a film?
I came across it because somebody gave it to me. I mean, it was really very simple. I mean, they gave it to me in a context. I was having a discussion on a film set, on a short film set actually, with a group of people about my grandfather on my mother's side, who was born in Virginia and into a black family. He was racialized black, he was socialized black, and then at a certain point in his life, he made the decision to pass for white. And he ended up in Detroit, where he had my mother and her sisters. And by the time she was born, he was living an entirely white life, and everything else that before him was erased, essentially. At the time, I didn't really know the specifics of this. I knew snippets of information. It was very much a puzzle for me. I knew that my mother looked a certain way, and I always asked her, but there was a lot of confusion and evasion around it. The question. It would be maybe I'm black, maybe my father was this, maybe he was Native American, maybe that's what we are. I don't know. There's no way of answering this. But the conversation would sort of end there. And I think that the older I got, the more it sort of haunted me a little bit. And I found myself being very curious about it. And so when I read the book, it was I think it honestly gave me a context to understand my curiosity a little bit, because I could very easily have internalized the same sort of evasion and minimization, rather. Is that a word? Yes. That of what my mother inherited. But I didn't for some reason, because I think I was interested in the psychological complexity that follows with this sort of story in a family history. And the book made me see that, because it gave me compassion and empathy for my father's choice, but it also gave me a sort of understanding of the psychological toll of a life lived in hiding, and how that is generationally passed on, honestly. And I don't think I'd thought about that prior to the book in such clarity. And I was gobsmacked that something that was written in 1929 could incite this huge sort of rethinking of so much in my life so many years later. I was also utterly blindsided by how contemporary it felt, and how modern it felt, and how ultimately it's a discourse about how much freedom any of us have to be ourselves, and how we work out what ourselves are and what we want to be versus what we think we ought to be, because what we have taken in from society or feel that we should be. And that felt so real to me now, every bit as much as it must have done in 1929, although I don't even know that it was interpreted that way in 1929. It's, arguable that people sort of reduced it to a rather straightforward reading the time it came out. A lot of the complexity of the book was missed at time of publication, so she was arguably ahead of her time. But even understanding that was shocking to me. And I mean, to cut to the chase here, I was so moved by the book, so affected by it. I wanted to spend more time with it, and I couldn't stop the movie playing in my head that I imagined of it. I immediately saw it in black and white, certain images, certain ways of depicting these women capturing the layers, how to reveal those layers, how to depict a woman who is quietly falling apart and doesn't even realize that she is, all started flooding into my brain. So I sat down and wrote a screenplay in 10 days after reading the book. And then honestly, I was very frightened of it because it felt so enormous. It felt very potent, very big for me, very big for personally speaking, but also as an effort for a first time filmmaker. And it sat in a drawer for 6 years. And then eventually I got over that and got it out of the drawer and decided to make it. And then I spent 7 years actively trying to get money for it and trying to get people to let me make it.
Yeah, that's really interesting because I would not have thought that it would have taken so long for it to go from being an idea to actually being realized. And I think that's an important lesson for folks who are interested in filmmaking or even producing the whole process of filmmaking. And I I like that you talked about the complexity and the layers because I think that's really clear. Both Ruth, Tessa, you two seem to have really understood the complexity. And what's interesting is in such a short amount of time, we got to understand something about the humanities of these characters and even ourselves. That was the scary part, I think, in watching this film, is we discovered who these women were, but we also discovered who we were. If you're watching the film very carefully, we'll start with you, Tessa, and then Ruth. I'd like you to answer this as well. How do you prepare for something like that? Because it could have easily have been a very two-dimensional kind of portrayal, but in the nuances in the portrayal, we see that there's this complexity, this internal battle, or multiple internal battles. Tessa, could you talk about that? Preparing for that, how do you get in the brain for it?
Goodness. Well, I think it's sort of like a thing that people say that it's kind of all begins on the page, and I think that's true to a large extent, but particularly in this one, we had this gorgeous source material that is Nella Larsen's extraordinary, dense, yet slim 93 pages. So much happens inside sort of like the hearts and minds of these women and her way of articulating it is so beautiful. And Rebecca did such a tremendous job, I think, communicating that also in filmic language. So I felt very assisted uh, by that. And also, I think a tremendous amount of trust from Rebecca because I think, as you say, these women are really complex, and sometimes there's this idea inside of acting, for example, that it's impossible to play sort of two things at once. And I think we know as humans that we are many things at once. And particularly, I think Irene, who is really struggling internally and has some very complicated feelings, both about herself, her husband, certainly about Ruth's character, Claire. Um, and I think something that felt really exciting to me is to try to capture a sense of privacy. I think we really, it felt quite intimate working on this. We were having a conversation earlier, and a journalist said that it felt like both Ruth and I had a sense of there was something kind of secretive about what these women share. And I love that. I've, been very lucky to get to work on a lot of very different kinds of material, but I think this sort of, the intimacy in this project feels really singular to me.
Yeah, that leads to a number of other questions regarding privacy, the private lens into the lives of these people. But even thinking directorially, how you can present everyday life from a period of time that most people think they know just based on photographs, but we saw something very different because we were actually in the kitchens and the bedrooms, and somehow it was believable and it came to life. Along those lines, Ruth, can you talk about your ability to see the complexity in your character as well, and how you were able to manifest that in a way that we all could connect to?
Well, I mean, Nella's novella was, I mean, indescribably helpful for me. I mean, it's all in there. It's all in there. You know what I mean? I mean, I don't know if on my own I could have constructed as complex a character as that. And that's testament to this woman's brain, isn't it? Yeah, for me, you just you scour the novel for any sort of hints, physically, vocally, tonally, all of that. And for me, I don't know. I just sort of sit with a person, daydream about them. I think I rely a lot on my unconscious, subconscious kit bag that I hope I've amassed over a lifetime. I think it's hard to articulate really how you absorb someone and their energies. It's getting harder as I get older. I don't know why. But for me, everything was in Rebecca's script and the novel, and then when it came to it, your fellow actors. That's really where it lies. That's where your character, your part comes alive. It only comes alive in relation to the others, other people. That's why every unless you're doing a one person show, every character that I make is an ensemble character. Do you know what I mean? Because it just by its nature, that's what acting is. And so you can do all your research and stuff like that, but it's the heady chemicals of the day, whatever day it is, and what happens, and it's when three people's prep collides, with the directors and the cinematographers and the catering people. Do you know what I mean? It's like a morass of energies. That sounds very like, I don't know, but it's the truth.
Well, it was very clear that it was an ensemble cast, right? That there was a real company there. As I was watching the film, it made me think so much about theater and how theater companies have to be a company because you're there live. And so you can really feel the energy when it's not authentic between characters. So that was really clear. But I think you're being modest a bit, and perhaps all three of you, in terms of how you can get beyond the layers of just the character, because there was always the sense of yearning, desire. What was really interesting, I think, about your character, Ruth, is that even though she seemed like an outsider, making herself an insider was no problem. But then Tessa, I felt that even though you were very comfortable as an insider, you lived in Harlem, you had this beautiful brownstone, this beautiful family, it seemed like you felt like an outsider for some reason. And so I think those are the kinds of complexities and layers of humanity, that you can feel, whether you're someone who's passing, you're LGBTQ, you're male, you're woman, whatever your identity might be. I think you all got beyond just the label, to looking at the human qualities of feeling like an insider and an outsider and what that meant. So along those lines, I'm wondering about motivations, Tessa, and then Ruth, and I'd like you to respond as well, Rebecca. How do you get to those layers of yearning and desire that really make up people, who we are as characters? What was your character actually yearning for?
Oh goodness. It's interesting, and we were talking about a certain sensation of privacy. I sort of feel that way about Irene, even speaking about the process to a certain extent. Like her secrets are mine, um, and I think also imperative in playing the character is not letting even the audience in sometimes, because she herself doesn't have access always to what she wants. I think something that Ruth's character Claire sparks inside of her is thinking about freedom, the sensation of freedom, like a very pivotal moment for me, which is not something that's even verbalized, is that moment when you see Irene come home from her daily task and Claire is outside sort of sunbathing, although there's no sun. She's in sort of the fresh air, and she has her, she's barefoot, and Irene can't, she can't really believe it, but it's so evocative and provocative and sensual for her to see this woman sort of inside of her body and her skin. And then on top of that, to see her in relationship to this woman, Zulina, who Irene has spent countless hours in the company of, and never can feel a sense of communion with her. And to see Ruth's character be able to have this sort of closeness with her so easily. I think she's longing and yearning for proximity to that kind of freedom, and also for a piece that I think explores identity, and as Rebecca says so elegantly, how much freedom do any of us have really in constructing our own identities. I think Irene looks at a woman like Claire and goes, goodness, it seems like she has an awful lot of choice. And even more so because she doesn't judge her own choices. She can say, on the stoop, just as boldly and plainly, I'm not safe. I'll do whatever it takes to get what I want. And I think Irene is trapped inside of an experience that feels really unsafe, because she cannot really show up with real authenticity as to, kind of what she is. And I think I really enjoyed all of the kind of critical reads. I loved engaging with the idea of this as a piece of queer literature. I loved engaging with it as a piece about infidelity. I think all those things are true. And I love the idea of audiences being able to take what they want. But I think for me, something that felt very interesting to explore is just this idea of repression, of not allowing oneself to be seen. And that to me didn't feel like an abstraction. I think we, as humans, we probably at one point or another, unless we're a very few rarefied lucky ones, have had an experience of feeling like we're hemmed in, and we're not allowing ourselves to be seen by others. And so that I sort of fundamentally understood, and it was about sort of expanding that, allowing myself to make that big and mighty, make that feel Hitchcockian and terrifying, and try not to be afraid to let people see that, even though it felt ugly and embarrassing. But to me, that's sort of the, like gift in a way. Even being able to sort of play in those ugly spaces is freeing. Sort of facing that like murky, uncomfortable territory. And I think hopefully it also sets other people free to do that. And then it was very just a joy to get to watch Ruth do in a way a very opposite thing, because then we're dancing together, and it's also just fun, like that in the tea room scene, for example, to be for myself just so still, but then to watch Ruth do these majestic things with so many props and clothing, and to watch her sort of flying around the room like this free bird is very, very fun. Very, very fun to be dancing like that. Yeah.
And and I actually love that juxtaposition between the two characters, because you're right. You would think that the one that had the most freedom would be the most free, but she was actually, extremely repressed. And I was thinking, Ruth, your character, who you think would be very confined and suppressed and even oppressed to a great extent, you had the most freedom. Where do you think Claire's freedom stemmed from? How do you explain that? Because it's conveyed extremely well.
No, really. Do we have an innate sense of freedom? Still nature nurture, isn't it? I think I was very clear to me that what Claire was and is looking for is a mastery over her own life. Do you know what I mean? Because I think when she she was effectively an orphan, and then shipped off to these two white aunts, and I can't really believe they were too thrilled about that. And so I feel like when you're not kind of able to sort of navigate your own way in life, and it's something that you desire very much, and I think for her, she's quite brazen in her desires, and I think that the most brazen of all is a desire to be free of the shackles imposed by society, polite society, white or black. Also to break free of her assigned place in white America, enshrined by laws. So there's a lot for her. There's a lot of constraints that are trying to sort of smother that sense of freedom to be herself. And I think when you're trying to gain mastery of your life since you're really a kid, and really trying to define yourself for yourself without the constant interjections of society and opinions, that becomes second nature. Do you know what I mean? And I think you have a very different relationship to yourself if you've only had yourself to rely on. And I feel that's who Claire is. She is her own family, in many ways. And that, I feel that gives her a sort of, she has a responsibility to herself that I think she has really met. She's kept herself alive. She's given herself access to opportunities she might not have. She's come home. I mean, she's a success, really, when you think about it, with no help at all. She's a self-made woman. And, passing this decision to pass, decision, it's decision. Is it decision? Or is it something that you reluctantly engage in because otherwise the life that you perhaps want will be denied to you? So in a funny way, like if you have dreams and aspirations and you want to reach your potential, then you have to sort of lie. Many people did unwillingly lie, but the lie, for me, the lie is completely forgiven, because it's preposterous anyway, isn't it? It's preposterous to have to pretend you're something, you're one color, just to have access to opportunity to fulfill your potential. I don't know. I'm still thinking about her. I'm still constructing her even now, 2 years later, and deconstructing her.
Well, it's interesting. You said a couple of things. One, lie and construction. And so You have me thinking more about the character and even the story in a very different way. Is that's really central, right? The freedom isn't necessarily a freedom, just a sort of human or spiritual freedom, but looking at reality, the construction of race as the lie. So even the construction of race and the constraints itself are what confine us. And to a certain degree, Claire said, I don't accept your lie and I don't accept your construction. And maybe that's where the freedom stems from. Um, if that's the case, Rebecca, did you see that in the original novel, or is that something you picked up on and said, I want to really explore with these characters more?
No, I think you've hit the sort of central nerve of what I think it really gets to. And I think I was thinking about that all the time, you know, how, how passing it highlights the divisions it's trying to disappear, but it also points out the absurdity of the categorizations in the first place. And there's and similarly, I sort of kept with that thing, and that's partially got me thinking about the black and white. Black and white film is in itself a label and a categorization. We call it black and white. It draws attention to this sort of notion, this binary, but it also draws attention to its absurdity because black and white film is actually gray. It's got nothing to do with these one things or the others, and yet we're so busy trying to name and categorize and put everyone in certain kinds of boxes. And that was really a driving theme for me often with the whole thing. I mean, so much of this is about the performance of identity, be it racial or gender or sexual or class. There's a performance of these things that is going on all over this story. And, again, another decision was to cast 2 Black women that the world has an understanding in the culture of identifying as Black, because in a sense then you were always aware of their performance. And if I had cast people that look very, very, that you receive as white, you don't think about them performing that aspect of their identity. You just go, oh, look how white they look. End of. You're not experiencing it in that way. So yes, I was constantly thinking about this, constantly thinking about how I could play with the audience's sense of perception and context, in the sense that, we all, whether we admit to it or not, we all perceive things very differently according to what context we're looking at it. And I find it fascinating that so many people watch this film and they say to me, but I absolutely see this one thing. And then someone comes along who says the complete opposite. It's like, but I'm telling you categorically, I see this. And I'm like, well, yeah, of course.
Mm-hmm.
That's sort of the world that we're dealing with.
Yeah, and and this idea that whatever the humanity is that's on display or being revealed in the story has to be this one thing, as opposed to thinking about we're many different things, which I think Tessa, your character, most certainly displays, and even the conflict there. She's a mother, she's a wife, she's a Black woman, she's a Black woman who can pass for white, but she's also a woman. Right? Her own individual. And I'm just wondering, how do you convey all of that at once? That's really difficult to do. I mean, I think setting scenes in the home really helped because you're interacting with all of these different people. But to be able to as a viewer, to feel that conflict, how do you do that? And more importantly, I guess, Rebecca, as well, how do you write that kind of character?
Do you want me to jump in? I feel like that's very
Oh,
hard.
sure. Yeah, either one.
Well, I just feel like when actors get asked these questions, it's like, this is the alchemy of acting. You can't answer a lot of those questions.
Yeah, James Baldwin said, asking me how I write these novels is like asking me how do I breathe. It's like you just do. If you're really good at it, you just
do. It's a blend of instinct and brain, and you have to find the balance between the two. I think, to me, in terms of how to make it real on film, I think and a lot of it was in the screenplay. And I think it's a lot to do with juxtaposition, you know, and playing with images that rub up against antithetical feelings that are being expressed. So, you know, like the backyard scene that's not in the book. I completely invented that scene, but it felt very important to me that it's a scene that's about that included Zulina and was a scene about that was domestic and normal on some level, but the presence of the audacity of Claire being there in her bare feet and being able to see what that does to Irene tells a completely different story, which is incredibly potent for the larger story. And then you also see them have this exchange about their consideration of each other when they were adolescents. They start the scene talking about the neighbor over the road who's just hit puberty. So you're immediately bringing sex into the scene. And then they're evoking when they were both being sexualized themselves also. And then they both start talking about how they regard each other's beauty. And you see the effect of that on Irene's character, and it reveals something, just giving her that space. And also you cast Tessa Thompson and Ruth Negga because you set all that up on the script, but it's not there. It's in the subtext. You're relying on them to then feel that. But it's really about allowing space in the scene for those looks and those communications, and that's frisson of erotics and tension, and also playing it suspensefully at the same time as romantically. And then it comes to life. But without all those elements, it doesn't. I mean, that's an example, but there are other examples of a similar kind of thing. It's, you know, it's them talking about freedom and the shackles of, or not, of motherhood, with the children stomping above their heads. That's, again, that's a more of an oral juxtaposition, but that's really how I thought about it a lot.
I was thinking about the dance hall scene and the tensions that were there. Now, what's really interesting, it's almost like you're in the dance hall yourself and you notice these tensions between people, but you're not exactly sure what they are. And I was wondering, Tessa, as you were playing Irene, in that scene, one, what's your relationship with Hugh? And two, what's the tension that's happening there?
I'm so pleased that you mentioned that scene because it's one of my favorites. Was one of my favorites to perform for a number of reasons. I felt like it was, you know, that line that Irene has to cue this idea that we're all of us passing for something or other. It's like the only moment I really think she tells on herself. And she's also keeping her friend honest because he himself is passing in his own way. I think there's so many interesting layers because she allows Hugh to come in and they're having a conversation about, you know, fetishization, like the ways in which Black folks can be fetishized. He's sort of talking about his wife and the women that are inclined to sort of fetishize these young Black men. And all the while, he is himself fetishizing Irene, which she kind of calls him out on, but not entirely. I also just love that there was a real, you know, rhythm to the scene, that it feels like it sort of has its own sort of pace and clip. And also, not for nothing, just that to be on set, that was one of our last days, to see all of these beautiful Black folks moving through space is just something that I will always cherish. You know, our film obviously takes place in a time, there's this sort of you know, suggestion of this renaissance that's happening, but it's a pretty lonely, you know, movie in its way. You don't actually see that many, you know, joyful moments of community necessarily, but I felt like I was constantly engaging with those ideas when we were shooting in some of those places. We shot exclusively in Harlem pretty much over 23 days. You'd go into some of those houses and I really felt like I could feel Nella Larsen with us. Like, had she been in those houses before at a party, maybe. And so getting to shoot that scene and really have the movie have that sort of just a glimpse of, you know, the spirit of 20s and jazz and, you know, to sort of live inside of that. It also felt like you get the sense, I mean, we shot entirely out of sequence, but it's really, I think for that reason, in terms of process, it's really important that you have kind of, not that there's not freedom, but a map a little bit in your mind, and remembering that when they then go home from this dance, there's something that's reinvigorated in Brian and Irene's dynamic, even physically or sexually, that has to do with the presence of Claire. And so you sense from that moment that something has changed in a cellular way, with her presence in their life. And I love just, that's one of the joys of performance, is to really think about how all of these moments, as much as you are kind of inside of them in a very hopefully visceral and spontaneous way, how they also, influence all of the other moments that end up on screen, in a way, as you're charting a character's journey, particularly with someone like Irene. So I just love, and Bill Camp is so fantastic in that scene, and it's a joy to work with. You don't have very many days, and so someone has to come in and have a sense of history. And I just thought he brought such a tremendous tenderness for Irene. You really sense their history, and I think he's a composite character from Nella's own life, and so I thought Bill just brought that so wonderfully, which is a testament to his talent, to be able to do that. It feels like alchemy or something.
As you were talking, why this project and why now? It seems so relevant, but it is set, say 100 years ago. Why is this project important for us to visit now? What should we take away from the project? What lesson can we take away from the project?
Well,
And it
that's a
can even be
huge
artistic.
question.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be a deep.
And that's not a criticism.
It's hard not
Yeah,
to give a huge answer to that. I'll give a short one. I think it's confronting, and I think on a really basic level, I think it was always my intention, and I hope that this is true, that you have to really engage with the material. Like, you have to work a little bit to get the most rewards from it. And I think that if you do, it can be quite confronting, because ultimately I think what the movie is saying, and probably what the book is saying, but certainly what the movie is saying, is, how are you lying to yourself? And I think, that can be complicated for people. And I think that it would never have worked as a contemporary. I couldn't have moved it into contemporary world in the same way. But that doesn't mean it doesn't resonate to the contemporary world.
Mhm.
Hugely. The reason why it resonates is partially because we're looking at something that's historical, at a time when there was an extremity of rigidity around this sort of, as James Baldwin puts it, passion for categorization. Whether you're a mother, you're this, you're a wife, you're straight, this is precisely that. And we can see that, but we can also see ways in which that rigidity is affecting us now in this moment without us even realizing, because the world looks much less rigid. And I think it's only potent because it's 1929. So you see that effect.
Well, thank you. That was a great answer. And I'm going to remember that as I talk about the film to everyone. I'm going to use that answer as if I came up with it. By the way, so thank you all. Thank you all. This has been wonderful. If there's nothing else you'd like to add, I guess I'd like to thank you on behalf of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And I have to tell you, folks, passing on Netflix. If you don't have Netflix, I suggest you get it or find a way to see this movie. And I think it's a good time, as we're going into the holidays, to sit down with family and perhaps talk about some of the issues here. Thank you once again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.